Chapter 1. The Girl Who Danced on Rooftops. It is an oft-observed truth that London has moods of its own expressions that ripple through its fog-drenched lanes, its cramped attics, its thousand chimney stacks, like a citywide dream that has turned unexpectedly sour. It was on such a morning in late October, grimy with mist and the reek of coal fires, that I, Dr. John H. Watson, was roused from my reverie at breakfast by the sound of Holmes striking a telegram against the hearth. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he stood at the fire with one slippered foot planted on the fender, studying the crisp blue slip of paper as though it were a scrap of ancient parchment. There was something in the line of his shoulders, a tautness that told me the matter, whatever it was, would not be a simple one. "Well," I ventured, folding down my newspaper, "is it another headless corpse in Soho, or a Russian duchess, frightened by her own reflection?" Holmes turned, one eyebrow raised. "Neither. A girl has vanished, though not in the conventional sense. Kidnapped. No. Witnessed dancing barefoot upon the sloped tiles of a 5-story rooftop in Hampstead Heath, and then seen no more." I blinked. "You're not serious, Watson." "When am I ever frivolous with telegrams?" I reached out and took the paper. It was addressed from Inspector Tobias Gregson of Scotland Yard, man Holmes regarded as more capable than Lestrade, though still prone to premature conclusions. Strange case. Girl reported dancing on rooftops at dawn, in full view of 3 witnesses. Now vanished. No sign of injury, no evidence of descent. Building secured. Family distraught. Possible foul play or delusion. Request your immediate attention. Gregson read the message twice. "Is this a circus performer gone awry?" I asked, glancing up. "Hardly. The girl in question, Miss Annalise Rowland, is the daughter of Reverend Julius Rowland of Maygrove Parish, a quiet household. Numbered acrobats, no history of mental instability, no secret ladders, trapdoors, or other theatrical devices one might expect. And the witnesses, 3 reliable ones, a grocer, a chimney sweep, and a schoolmistress. Independent sightings, no collusion, all placing her atop the spired roof of Rosewell Terrace just past sunrise. She appeared calm, moving rhythmically. Then she vanished, neither seen climbing up, nor down, and no body." I pressed. "No clothing snagged on gutters, or evidence of a fall?" "None," said Holmes, and now his eyes gleamed. "Hence, the impossibility. A girl, dancing where no person could easily stand, then gone with no earthly route of escape. I dare say we have before us either a miracle, a hoax, or more likely a very clever deception." He swept to the hat stand and collected his Inverness cape. I hesitated. "Holmes, even you must admit, it sounds ... fantastical." "Watson," he said, already halfway to the door, "if we began to discard every case that sounded fantastical, I would have died of boredom years ago. Fetch your coat. We're off to Hampstead." Rosewell Terrace lay on the cusp of Hampstead Heath, where the city's smog gave way to chill breezes and half-forgotten thickets. When we arrived, the building in question loomed above the quiet lane, 5 stories of weathered stone, its steep gabled roof crusted with moss. The chimney stacks jutted skyward like the crooked fingers of a buried giant. Inspector Gregson stood outside, consulting with a uniformed constable. He turned as Holmes approached, his face lined with worry. "Glad you're here, Holmes. This one's beyond us." "Tell me only what is known," Holmes replied briskly, shaking the inspector's hand. Gregson led us indoors, up a narrow staircase, each creaking step climbing deeper into the mystery. "Witnesses say she was barefoot, dancing lightly across the slate arms raised, turning slow circles like some kind of ritual. No ladder, no access points, no way to descend without breaking your neck. The roof has been searched thoroughly. No footprints, nothing but a broken pink-gilded floral, possibly hers, and her room, locked from the inside." "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "Very interesting." We entered the top-floor flat. It was sparsely furnished, a narrow bed, a cedar writing desk, and a cracked window that opened outward toward the sharply slanted roof. Holmes went straight to it, peering out, then withdrawing with a short nod. "She came out this way," he said. "There's a faint smear on the sill-chalk dust, not soot. No trailing fabric, though. Remarkable." The room was clean, almost obsessively so. On the desk sat a dog-eared book of poems by William Blake. Holmes flipped it open and read aloud, "Great things are done when men and mountains meet. This is not done by jostling in the street." Blake, he muttered, a mystic's mind. We'll need to tread carefully. He turned, sweeping his gaze across the room. Gregson, he said, no one enters or leaves this flat until I say otherwise. Dr. Watson and I will remain until we've examined the premises in full. Gregson nodded, though he looked uneasy. As he departed, I turned to Holmes. You believe she escaped somehow? I believe, said Holmes, that no person can vanish entirely without leaving behind some echo of their passage. The roof may hide the body, the mind may hide the motive, but the truth hides in neither. It lies in what is overlooked. And with that, he knelt beside the desk, extracting a faint scrap of something from beneath, one leg pressed tightly. Nearly invisible, he handed it to me. A scrap of black ribbon, frayed at the edge, silk, and faintly scented. Ritual, Watson, he said quietly, but not hers. As the wind moaned outside the cracked window, I suddenly felt it something, hidden in the bones of the house, something watched. A presence, not entirely gone, or perhaps, as Holmes would later say, merely moved. Chapter 2. Holmes in the locked room. Holmes remained crouched beside the cedar desk for some moments longer, inspecting the minute scrap of silk he had uncovered. His eyes moved not just with scrutiny, but with something more precise and almost predatory stillness that I had come to associate with his most engaged state of reasoning. I stood by the door, notebook in hand, unsure whether to speak. Eventually, he looked up. The edge is burnt, he said softly. See here, singed and curled, not torn, scorched, and faintly fragrant. I stooped beside him. Perfume, I offered. Not quite. The base is floral, but the underlying note clove, aniseed, something ritualistic. He rose then, brushing dust from his knees. Watson, he said, what do you make of the girl's disappearance? I glanced about the sparse room. She left by the window, certainly, though how she reached the roof barefoot, let alone danced on it, remains a puzzle. And the witnesses, if we take them at their word, we must. Holmes interrupted. All three described the same thing, down to the color of her dress, white cotton, ankle length, not the sort of garb worn by a woman who planned a leap to her death, nor by one wishing to escape unseen. He moved to the bed, where a simple grey shawl had been folded neatly. Beside it, a hairbrush with several long auburn strands still caught in the bristles. She intended to return, Holmes muttered, or at least left no signal of flight. I thought of the Blake poetry, the burned ribbon, the chalk on the sill, some kind of ritual. Then, I suggested hesitantly. Holmes gave me a look not quite disdainful, but close. Ritual is a word we use when logic eludes us. We cloak mystery in mysticism to shield ourselves from embarrassment. He turned to the window, swinging it open. The roof was treacherous, slanted at a harsh angle, slick with dew, and streaked with the soot of years. Holmes stepped lightly, crouched low, his fingers splayed wide for balance. I followed with considerably more caution, my boots slipping on the uneven tiles. From up here, the street below looked impossibly distant. The fog hadn't lifted, and the chimneys from nearby houses made the view resemble some half-remembered fever dream. Holmes pointed to a gutter, where a fragment of cloth was snagged white cotton, just as described. Beside it, a smear of pale dust. Chalk again, he murmured, transferred from foot to tile. He looked around, scanning the landscape. There, he said suddenly, pointing toward the opposite building. Note the roofline, slightly flattened on the third chimney. And do you see that copper drain pipe? It's new, the only one that isn't rusted through. You think she crossed to the next roof? I think someone did. We clambered back. Inside, Holmes, once more absorbed, returned to the writing desk and withdrew the poetry book. He rifled through the pages rapidly until he came to one near the center and tapped it. Listen to this, Watson. Blake again. He read aloud. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. He snapped the book shut. Miss Rowland was a student of mysticism, and yet her study was orderly. No incense, no candles, no fevered scrawlings in the margins. She read Blake the way one reads a prayer book, devoutly, but not feverishly. And the witnesses, we shall speak with them at once. The first was Miss Clara Penwell, a schoolmistress who lived in the neighboring terrace. She was a tall, angular woman with spectacles balanced on the end of her nose and a manner that brooked no contradiction. I know what I saw. Mr. Holmes, she said firmly, once seated in the Rowland drawing room. It was dawn. I rise early. My desk faces the rear alley, and I looked up. She was there, on the ridge of the roof, twirling, not wildly, mind you, it was graceful, like a ballerina or a statue come to life. Did she appear distressed? No, said Miss Penwell. She was serene, eyes closed, barefoot, arms raised. It was hauntingly beautiful. Holmes inclined his head. Did she appear to be alone? The woman hesitated. Yes, but, Holmes prompted. I had the distinct impression, how to say this, of something watching her. From where? She flushed. That I couldn't say. It was just a feeling. I know how that sounds. Holmes made no remark. He simply noted something in his book and nodded. We spoke next with a chimney sweeper boy of no more than 15, named Alfie Wicks. His account was less poetic, more matter-of-fact. She was up there all right, he said. Just after the bell tolled 6, I was atop number 19 clearing a stack. Saw her clear as day, white dress, bare feet, hair down like she'd been sleepwalking. Did she climb up from the flat? No chance, the boy said with certainty. The angle's too steep. She were placed there, if you ask me. Placed by whom? Dunno, but she didn't jump nor fall. Just gone. Lastly, we called upon the grocer, Mr. Emmett Varney. His shop faced Rosewell Terrace from the far end of the lane, and he claimed to have seen the girl in silhouette through the drifting morning fog. She was still, he said, not dancing, exactly, just standing, with arms wide, like she was waiting for something. For what? Holmes asked. I thought at first it was the wind. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Wind, he repeated. Indeed, back at the flat, Holmes stood at the center of the girl's bedroom, silent as stone. At length, he spoke. Watson, this is not merely a question of disappearance. It is a performance, one that was rehearsed, observed, and vanished in the span of minutes. Do you believe she was abducted? No, I believe she was witnessed. And now we must find out why. He moved to the window once more and stared toward the chimneys. We are looking, Watson, for a mind that manipulates not the body, but belief. The rooftops were a stage, the girl a symbol, and somewhere in this city, someone is watching for our next move. He turned back, eyes alight, and I intend to give them one. Chapter 3. The first clues. A scene of deception the following morning dawned with a brittle clarity. The kind that comes after a night of rain. Rooftops glistened like polished slate, and the mist that usually clung to London's skyline had withdrawn to the countryside. Holmes was already dressed and at the hearth, scanning a fresh dispatch from the yard, when I emerged from my room. Tea still warm in my hands. The girl has not returned, he said, without looking up. Nor has a body been found, nor a note, nor a single meaningful trace of her intent. I suppose that leaves us exactly where we began. On the contrary, Holmes replied, tapping the telegram with a knuckle. Gregson's men uncovered something during a secondary search of the building. The attic above Miss Rowland's flat, locked and long forgotten, contains a set of curious items. He snapped the paper, a lantern, a set of chalk stubs, a strip of painted muslin, and several burned candles embedded in an earthen saucer. That's where we begin. The attic of number 17 Rosewell Terrace was not easily reached. It required a narrow key, which the landlady, Mrs. Gate, a woman of sour temperament and failing eyesight, claimed had not been used in over a decade. Dust caked the hinges, and it took Holmes and a constable several minutes of patient effort to force it open. Inside was a room no larger than a wardrobe, with rafters that bowed like hunched shoulders. The only light came from a small circular window, stained amber with grime. It cast a honeyed glow over the strange collection Gregson had described. The muslin lay draped over a pair of mismatched crates, crudely forming a table. Upon it rested the earthen saucer, the waxy remains of 7 candles melted into a single mound. Arranged around it were empty chalk boxes, a pair of brass compasses, and what appeared to be the torn spine of a diary, its pages removed. Holmes knelt immediately. Observe, Watson, the chalk residue is pale blue, not typical white, used often by tailors for patterning, and yet, here, it was used upon wood. Why? He pointed to the floor. Thin, pale lines, almost invisible, traced geometric patterns along the boards. A triangle inscribed within a circle, a row of 7 stars, and, curiously, a spiral leading inward toward a single black smudge. It's not occult, Holmes muttered. It's mathematical. I frowned. But what was its purpose? To project an illusion, Holmes said. A calculated distortion, perhaps of meaning, perhaps of movement. I studied the cramped space. It feels like a place of rehearsal, a studio, or theater. Holmes gave a tight nod. Exactly. The girl's dancing was not spontaneous, it was prepared. And not for art's sake, for effect. He turned to the broken diary spine. No initials, torn deliberately. Removed pages suggest concealment, not decay. Someone took the contents but left the vessel. That implies urgency or carelessness. He stood, brushing dust from his coat. This attic was her secret, or someone's, but it wasn't magic, it was method. We descended to the second floor once more, and Holmes requested we examine the girl's wardrobe. With the landlord's permission, he pried open the small armoire. Inside, hanging beside 2 wool dresses and a raincoat, was a length of white cotton similar to what the witnesses had described. But the garment was no nightgown. It was a dancer's rehearsal shift, hemmed for movement, reinforced at the seams. Light, durable, deliberate. Holmes ran a finger along the stitching. This was not chosen in haste. It was sewn for a purpose. The question is, by whom? He withdrew a magnifying lens from his coat and peered at the collar. Thread is grey, machine-sewn, London-made. But this, he pointed to a mark inside the collar feint, almost invisible. A tailor's initial J.H. could have belonged to a theatrical costumer. I asked. Possibly. Or a teacher, a mentor, someone who provided the means of performance. We must trace this initial. Holmes folded the shift with care and returned it to the armoire. I believe we are at the edges of a performance designed not for an audience, but for transformation, he said. This girl was not escaping. She was becoming. Becoming what? That, Holmes said gravely, is the question. That afternoon we paid a visit to Reverend Roland. The man who greeted us was grey at the temples, though not yet 50. His hands trembled slightly as he gestured us into his study. Books lined every wall, devotional texts, of course, but also volumes on comparative theology, ancient rites, and philosophy. I don't know what to tell you, Mr. Holmes, he said wearily. My daughter was ... thoughtful, solitary, but never unstable, never dangerous. She was kind, she played the piano, she walked daily at dusk. Did she ever mention dreams? Holmes asked. Not often, but she had a fondness for Blake, and for Spinoza. Curious combination. The Reverend gave a dry smile. She believed the soul was more than a thing to be saved. She believed it was ... elastic. Elastic, I repeated. She said that once, he replied, rubbing his forehead, that the soul stretched across time, like shadow. That's how she explained déjà vu. Holmes leaned forward. Did she ever speak of a man named J.H., or frequent any theatre troupes? The Reverend's eyes narrowed. No, but she received letters, not many, hand-delivered, oddly, from a man who never signed his name. Holmes's fingers twitched. Do you have any? The Reverend stood and fetched a small tin box. Inside were 3 folded papers, each without envelope. Holmes unfolded them, and I peered over his shoulder. Each letter was written in elegant, script florid, almost poetic. They spoke of thresholds, of transcendence, of dancing until the veil tears. They were not romantic, but fervent. She kept them, the Reverend whispered, though I warned her they were nonsense. Holmes was silent for a long time. These were not nonsense, he said finally. They were instruction. He looked up sharply. Watson, we must find the messenger who would deliver such letters. A believer, Holmes said, and believers often make themselves seen when they think the curtain has fallen. He turned to the Reverend. When did the last letter arrive? 2 nights before her disappearance. Holmes stood. Then the author is still near. And, with that, we left the house, stepping into the London dusk knot, knowing that the next move would not be ours, but the dancers. Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. It was just past 8 the next morning when Holmes and I returned to Rosewell Terrace under skies bruised with rain. A fresh constable had been stationed at the entrance, and the girl's flat remained sealed. Gregson, ever dutiful, had assembled a list of persons connected to Miss Annalise Rowland, those who lived above, below, or frequented the property in the days before her disappearance. Holmes scanned the names with interest, nodding at intervals. Could begin with the immediate tenants. No one vanishes without proximity playing a part. We began on the floor beneath the Rowland flattered dim corridor that echoed slightly with every footstep. The first name on the list was Miss Burrell, Keene, a milliner of 37 years who had lived at number 17 for over a decade. She greeted us at the door wearing gloves despite the warmth of her flat. Her eyes were pale and watery, and she spoke with that peculiar detachment I had come to associate with solitary lives. "Miss Rowland," she said, tilting her head. "Strange girl. Kind, certainly. Quiet, but always looked as though she were listening to something just beyond the wall." "Did you speak often?" Holmes asked. "Oh no," she said, "once or twice in the stairwell." She asked once if I knew anything about transcendent geometry. I thought she meant a new style of hat. "Did she have visitors?" I asked. "Rarely, but there was one, a man. I never saw his face, came only in the late hours. He never knocked, just slipped something through the door and left." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "Describe him as best you can." "Tall, wore a scarf, even in July, carried a cane, though he walked well enough. Something about him gave me chills, if I'm honest. Moved like he knew he shouldn't be seen." "And how often did he appear?" "Once every fortnight, perhaps. The last time was 3 days before she vanished." Holmes tapped the brim of his hat. "Thank you, Miss Keene. You've been most helpful." The next flat belonged to Mr. Lionel Tyburn, a retired marine cartographer with the shoulders of a sailor and a temper that flared without warning. "She's gone, then?" he asked gruffly, pulling open his door with the stained handkerchief still in one hand. "Not surprised. Girls like that always vanishing. Mine's in the clouds. She once asked me if oceans had memories." Holmes perked up. "And your reply?" "I told her, the sea doesn't remember, it only returns." "She liked that, I think." "Did she ever enter your flat?" "Once," Tyburn admitted. "Said she wanted to see my maps. Stared at the Arctic Circle for 10 minutes straight, then asked if I believed the sky and sea were mirrors of one another." "Did she ever mention a man, or correspondences?" "Only that she was waiting for a signal, that when it came, she'd have to go." "A signal?" I echoed. "She didn't say what it was, just smiled and said, 'You'll know it when it doesn't come.'" Holmes fell quiet for a moment, then thanked the man and turned away. On the top floor, we found a tenant who might have seemed the most innocuous, a music teacher named Felix Quinn, slender, soft-spoken, and balding. Mr. Quinn appeared from behind a cracked door and blinked owlishly as Holmes introduced us. "Annalise," he said, with surprise. "Oh, she was lovely, quiet, but inquisitive. Came to me once, asking about dissonance, musically. At first, yes, but then she began asking whether sound could undo silence, whether certain harmonies could create space, abstract notions." Holmes' eyes shone. "She visited often, only twice, but she left me a question I haven't yet solved, which was, if a sound could be made without being heard, would it still change the world?" Quinn gave a sheepish shrug. "I told her it sounded like philosophy, not music. She would have seen no difference," Holmes murmured. Quinn frowned, thoughtful. "There was one thing," he added. "The night before she vanished, I heard something music, not from her flat, from the roof." Holmes stiffened. "You're certain?" "Quite a soft, repetitive humming, low notes, almost like Gregorian chant. Then a footstep, too deliberate for a cat, or wind, and silence. Time, 3:15. Holmes scribbled in his notebook, lips pressed thin. "Been most enlightening, Mr. Quinn." Outside, the rain had begun to fall in earnest. We paused under the shelter of a narrow overhang, Holmes watching the water ripple in the gutter as if it carried messages from some distant sender. "3 neighbors," I said, "each with a piece of her mind." "Yes," he murmured. "Miss Keene sees a girl who listens through walls. Tyburn speaks of the sea's memory, and Quinn hears music that alters space. What unites them, Watson?" I hesitated. "They all saw pieces of something, larger, precisely, but none saw her entirely. They were watching an echo, a rehearsal. She was drawing meaning from each of them, but never revealing her full script. And the man with the scarf," Holmes turned, "he exists. The letters, the visits all suggest an influence, someone who believes, or wishes others to believe, in the transcendent." He tapped his cane against the cobblestone. "But belief leaves residue, Watson, and the man who trades in it always returns for his reward." Back at Baker Street, Holmes spent the afternoon cross-referencing tailors bearing the initials J.H., who catered to dancers or performance artists. He also instructed me to send word to Wiggins and the irregulars to monitor the Rosewell Terrace vicinity for a tall man with a cane and scarf. "I expect," he said, "that if he knows she vanished as planned, he'll return not out of concern but To collect what she left behind. And what did she leave behind? Holmes held up the burned ribbon. A key, he said. Though to what, we have yet to discover. I stared at it. Frayed silk, brittle from fire and shivered, though the fire was warm. Chapter 5. First suspects. The red herring. By the following morning, the press had caught wind of the affair. The Evening Standard ran a breathless headline: "The Rooftop Girl of Rosewell Terror Spirit or Scandal." The article hinted at mysticism, vanishing acts, and a supposed secret society that operated under London's very rooftops. Holmes scanned the piece without amusement, then folded it into the hearth. "The press will always prefer shadows to substance," he muttered. "But the name is spreading," I said. "Perhaps that might bring someone forward." "It will bring someone," Holmes replied. "But whether they be a witness or a manipulator remains to be seen." At that moment, a knock interrupted our breakfast. It was Inspector Gregson, bowler, hat tucked under one arm, his face drawn with official purpose. "Holmes," he began, "we may have something for you. A potential suspect." Holmes gestured toward the settee. "Pray, enlighten us." Gregson produced a notebook and flipped it open. "A local constable recognized your man with the scarf, spotted near Ludgate Hill, entering a second-hand bookshop. Goes by the name of Jasper Hales. Seems harmless at first. Glance bit of a mystic street performer, dabbles in esoteric societies." Holmes looked up sharply. "Hales, Jota Aga, the very one, tailored his own garments. Apparently, used to run workshops for a spiritualist circle that dissolved last winter. More recently, he's been seen handing out leaflets claims to interpret dreams through patterned geometry. Where is he now?" "In custody." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "On what charge?" "None formal," Gregson admitted. "But the commissioner is keen to close the matter quickly. The public's grown nervous. If we can tie this Hales fellow to the girl's disappearance, well." Holmes rose. "We'll speak to him. But I caution you, Gregson, the most convenient suspect is often the least likely." We arrived at Bow Street Station just after midday. Hales was seated alone in a cramped interview room, hands folded neatly, scarf still draped over his shoulders despite the warmth of the space. He was tall, indeed thin as a reed, with pale lashes and an expression of amused detachment. "Mr. Hales," Holmes greeted him. "You've been rather difficult to find." "I wasn't hiding," Hales said softly. "I was waiting." "For whom?" "For her to become what she was always meant to be." Watson leaned forward. "You mean Miss Annalise Rowland?" Hales smiled faintly. "Annalise is no longer hers to name." Holmes ignored the evasiveness. "You knew her." "I guided her." "In what way?" "I offered her maps," Hales said. "Not of land, but of mind, of spirit, of rhythm." "You delivered letters to her door." "I left invitations." She answered in her own way. Holmes paused, his gaze cool. "Did you see her the night she vanished?" "No," Hales said calmly. "I saw the version of her that remained, the echo." "And what precisely do you believe happened to her?" "I believe she reached a threshold," Hales murmured, "and chose to step through." Holmes said nothing for a long time. Then, with calculated slowness, he reached into his coat and withdrew the burnt silk ribbon. "Recognize this?" Hales blinked once. "A marker of what?" "A beginning." I could scarcely suppress my irritation. "You speak in riddles." "Sir, are you saying you encouraged her to vanish?" "I say only that she danced," Hales replied, "and when she stopped, the world shifted." Holmes stood abruptly. "Come, Watson, are we finished?" "With him," Holmes said, "yes, but not with what he represents." Outside the station, I pressed Holmes for an explanation. "You don't believe he's guilty?" "No," Holmes said flatly. "He's a mystic, not a murderer. He believes his own abstractions, but he did not orchestrate her disappearance." "Then why the cloak and cane, the secret letters?" "Because he believes he is the architect of her transcendence, but he's merely the bait. Someone else used his guidance to mask a more material aim." "You mean she was manipulated?" Holmes nodded. "Precisely. And Hales was the perfect red herring, a man who invites suspicion by simply being eccentric." We walked in silence for several paces. Then Holmes said quietly, "What did Hales not mention?" I puzzled. "Her flat, her belongings, her father." "Exactly. He made no inquiry as to her world, only to her departure. He has no stake in what she left behind. That tells us two things. He truly believes she's gone somewhere else, and he has no idea what she was carrying. Was she carrying something? She was carrying meaning, Watson. something that matters enough to be chased, disguised, and erased. We reached Baker Street to find a message awaiting us. It was from Wiggins, tall man, scarf, spotted near a warehouse behind St. Dunstan's Church. He met with another man, short, limp in left leg, exchanged package, departed in separate directions. Holmes tapped the message with a satisfied air. There, now that's our man. By the time we reached the warehouse district, the sky had darkened with the threat of evening rain. The alley behind St. Dunstan's was narrow and paved in broken bricks. We approached the shuttered warehouse quietly, but Holmes gestured me to hold back. He approached the lock, inspected it, and then withdrew a small file from his coat. With practiced ease, he worked the tumblers, and the door gave with a soft click. Inside was a scene that mirrored the attic of Rosewell, terraced though larger and more elaborate. A circle of candles unlit, a cloth backdrop painted with sigils, a triangle etched in chalk, and at the center, a cracked mirror facing upward. "This is not Hale's doing," Holmes said quietly. "This is staging theater, and somewhere in this space lies the next layer of deception." I knelt beside the mirror. "What was it for?" Holmes answered without hesitation. "To reflect something no one was meant to see, or to distract from what they did." He bent beside me and, with his cane, tapped the mirror's edge. It slid, revealing a hollow compartment beneath. Inside, a letter, torn, sealed with red wax. The mark, a shaped like a dancer in mid-leap. Holmes tucked it into his coat. "The true game," he said, "has just begun." Chapter 6. The Secret Clue. A Hidden Inconsistency. We returned to Baker Street well past dusk, the rain having slicked the cobblestones to a black sheen. Holmes did not speak on the cab ride. His fingers tapped incessantly on his knee, his eyes not focused on the window but somewhere much farther. When we stepped inside and Mrs. Hudson offered tea, he waved it off with an impatient hand and instead moved directly to the fireplace. There, under gaslight, he carefully opened the red wax-sealed letter we had discovered beneath the mirror in the Eastcheap warehouse. The envelope contained but a single sheet of paper, folded 3 times. Holmes laid it flat on the desk. A performance must always end, but the audience remembers only what they are permitted to see. The girl was not the message, only the motion. "Keep the triangle intact." Holmes read it aloud once, then again silently. I leaned forward, but the note offered no obvious direction. "Who is A?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. He moved to his shelf, extracted his commonplace ledger, and began flipping through the indexed pages. At length, he stopped, tapping a page under assumed identities. "A is not a person," he said. "It is a role, a signature used in past communications tied to small theatrical groups, primarily those operating under pseudo-philosophical pretense rites, illusions, performance as spiritual metaphor, like Hale's. No, Hale's believes, a constructs. There is a difference. One drifts toward abstraction, the other controls it." He closed the ledger with a snap. "And here is the inconsistency, Watson. Would you care to guess it? I confess I see none." "Then let me illuminate. Jasper Hales is a mystic. His teachings, if one can call them that, revolve around transcendence, thresholds, symbolic gestures. But in the warehouse, what did we see?" I thought back. The mirror, the triangle, the painted backdrop. It resembled a ritual, yes, but lacked one thing. Holmes paused. Sincerity. He stood and crossed to his violin case, removing the instrument, and tucking it beneath his chin, he plucked a dissonant chord. An artist reveals self through process. But that warehouse, it was a set, arranged for effect, not meaning. It lacked the unintended details one finds in genuine obsession. He played a short, piercing note. Hales may have led her toward philosophy, but someone else used that path to stage something else entirely. Then what do you suspect? That we are being drawn along a constructed route, and like the candle that burned a hole in the floor, the illusion hides something weightier beneath. The next morning, Holmes requested we return to Rosewell Terrace, this time not to analyze his flat, but to the roof itself. The fog had lifted, and the sky was cruelly bright. We ascended the rear staircase and crossed the gap between the top floor and the upper hatch. Holmes emerged first, scanning the tiles with narrowed eyes. I followed more cautiously. The rooftop was quiet, save for the flapping of a loose bit of laundry from a line strung between chimneys. Holmes dropped to his knees near the spot where the chalk had first been found. Something always lingers, he murmured. Using his magnifying lens, he examined the lines of chalk once more. Then he stopped, frowned, and traced one segment with his finger. Watson, look at this curve. Imperfect. I stooped beside him. Meaning, someone drew this symbol quickly. Not with spiritual precision, but imitation. Sloppy. He moved, several feet away, to a soot-marked tile near the chimney, and yet here chalk residue in a second color. Yellow, not white. I blinked. That wasn't present before. No, Holmes said, which means someone came after we examined the scene. Recently, perhaps last night. He produced a pair of tweezers from his coat and extracted a sliver of torn paper from between two tiles. Upon inspection, it was part of a flyer, one of Hales's in fact, but the edge of it had a thumbprint, not in ink, but in a reddish residue. Watson, Holmes said slowly, do you have your medical kit? I handed it over. Holmes uncorked a vial of distilled water, dropped the paper inside, and added a trace of silver nitrate. After a few moments, the mixture turned a pale rose. Not blood, he said. Iron oxide. Rust. Rust from what? Possibly from a blade. Holmes stood slowly. Someone returned to the rooftop. Not to mourn or wander, but to retrieve something. Or to plant something. Another performance. Or the final scene, he said. We left the rooftop just as a carriage pulled up to Rosewell Terrace. A tall man in a charcoal coat stepped out. His movements stiff, a limp, just as Wiggins had described. Holmes stiffened. There, he whispered. Our missing conspirator. The man did not approach the front entrance. Instead, he crossed into the alley, glancing up at the roofs as he walked. Holmes and I followed, at a discreet distance. The man entered the same warehouse we had visited 2 nights before. This time, he did not lock the door behind him. We slipped in seconds after, and found him kneeling beside the cracked mirror, his hands groping beneath it. Holmes cleared his throat. The man spun round, up close. He was older than we'd assumed, mid-50s, with a deeply lined face and sharp eyes that flicked between us with a predator's calculation. Who are you? He barked. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he held up the red wax letter. You're A. Or rather, you've been using the symbol. The man's lip curled. You shouldn't be here. No, Holmes agreed. But neither should you. You tampered with the rooftop this morning. You've returned here, not to mourn, Miss Rowland, but to remove traces of your collaboration. You know nothing, the man said. Holmes stepped forward, his voice low and measured. You wanted her seen, not vanished, but she took your script and rewrote it. The performance escaped you. A flicker of fury passed over the man's face. She was mine, he hissed. I found her in the market, quoting Blake to pigeons. She wanted meaning. I gave her structure. Holmes nodded slowly. And when she transcended your design, you tried to drag her back. The man looked down at the mirror, but she was already gone, he muttered, left only shadows behind. Holmes turned away. Come, Watson, we have our answer, but not yet the truth. As we stepped back into the grey London light, Holmes murmured, the next move is not ours, but hers. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The following morning brought a grey drizzle, the kind that turned London's streets into mirrors of slate and shadow. Holmes was already at the breakfast table when I descended, poring over a pile of hastily written notes. The red wax letter lay beside his teacup, its torn seal now flaking. I've sent Wiggins to trail our warehouse acquaintance, he said without looking up. The man may not be our killer, but he is certainly our engineer, a failed playwright in search of an obedient muse. I sat, spooning marmalade onto my toast. You believe he orchestrated her disappearance as theatre? Not her disappearance, Holmes corrected. Her presentation, what we've seen so far, shock sigils, cloaks, mirrors it, is all misdirection. The true act was not spiritual but symbolic. Miss Rowland was transformed into myth. I blinked, but she is real, Holmes. Flesh and blood, or was. She is still real, Holmes replied. But the role she played was written by someone else. And now, I fear, she has begun rewriting it. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson appeared with a telegram. Holmes unfolded it, his brow tightening as he read. Man with limp, found unconscious in alley behind Queenhithe Dock. No ID. Minor head wound, nothing stolen. Taken to St. Bartholomew's. W. Holmes stood at once. We must go. St. Bartholomew's Hospital smelled of ether and damp wool. The ward sister led us to a narrow cot near the rear of the men's ward. The man from the warehouse lay motionless, his head bandaged, lips slightly parted. A constable stood at the foot of the bed, hat tucked under his arm. Blunt trauma, the nurse murmured. Perhaps a fall, though we found no sign of struggle. Holmes leaned closer. No wallet, no watch. The constable shook his head, clean as a banker's conscience. Holmes touched the man's sleeve, then moved his hand gently to the man's fingers. Ink beneath the nails. He was writing before the injury. A note, I asked, or copying one. Holmes glanced toward the nurse. Was anything unusual found on him? She nodded. A scrap of paper in his coat pocket. Barely legible. We thought it a list. She handed it over. Holmes read it silently, then passed it to me. The words, written in a scrawl nearly illegible, read : triangle ... candle ... ash within ... cryptic. I said. Desperate, Holmes replied. He was trying to remember something, or leave it behind. Could he have been pushed? I doubt it. More likely, he was followed then silenced. By whom? Holmes gave no answer. Instead, he stared at the man's bandaged head with narrowed eyes. If he recovers, he'll be useless. Whatever truth he held is now fractured. As we turned to leave, the constable cleared his throat. There's one more thing. He reached into his satchel and produced a flat, black object polished like obsidian, no larger than a playing card. We found this tucked inside his boot. Holmes took it, frowning. It was a mirror shard. Back on Baker Street. Holmes laid the shard beside the cracked mirror we had recovered from the warehouse. I watched as he turned them, aligned the edges, examined the reflective surface under gaslight. From the same mirror, he said finally, but this piece has been ... etched. He angled it toward me. At first, I saw only scratches, but then the shapes resolved into symbols. A triangle, a figure, a flame, symbolic residue. Holmes murmured. But it means someone else has begun adapting the performance. A new hand has entered the theater. I stepped closer. Then Miss Rowland is not merely gone, she's become a message. Holmes looked at me then, something sharp and unsettled in his gaze. Or a warning. Before I could reply, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, with a calling card upon a silver tray. Holmes took one glance and stiffened. Who is it? I asked. A very old name in very new hands. He handed me the card. It read, Miss Elodie Rowlandon, behalf of the estate of Howard Rowland, urgent family business. Confidentially. Looked up in confusion. Her sister. Holmes shook his head. She had none. He turned to fetch his coat. Then who? We'll ask her ourselves. Miss Elodie Rowland awaited us at a quiet parlour near Kensington Gardens, the air heavy with damask and pipe smoke. She was perhaps 30, severe in posture but elegant in dress. Her eyes were an unmistakable shade of violet, an echo of Annalise's, though colder, more calculating. She did not rise when we entered. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank you for coming. You are no relation, Holmes said at once. Not by blood, she replied calmly, but by intent. Explain. She offered no greeting. Instead, she produced a folded legal document. This is a letter of inheritance, she said, signed by Howard Rowland before his death. It names Annalise as his ward and designates me as her executor in the event of absence, disappearance, or death. My skin chilled. Holmes took the paper, scanned it swiftly. And when did you last see Miss Rowland? 3 days before she vanished. You spoke. No, I observed. Holmes arched a brow. Why? Because I was instructed to. Holmes leaned forward. By whom? Miss Elodie's eyes did not waver. By the man who called himself a we. Stepped back into the night with 1,000 questions and no simple answers. Holmes walked swiftly, the wind pulling at his coat. She's not a liar, he muttered. But she's not entirely honest either. She knew Annalise, watched her, certainly. May have helped frame the myth, but not out of malice, out of obligation. Then who holds the truth? Holmes stopped on the corner of Gloucester Road. I believe we've been looking in the wrong direction, he said. We've been asking who vanished. He turned to me. Now we must ask why did she stay visible for so long? And with that, he hailed a cab, eyes already burning with the next step. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. Holmes's energy that evening was electrocon-contained, bordering on dangerous. He paced the floorboards of 221B Baker Street, with the restless gait of a man whose thoughts were aligning into something too sharp. For comfort, I had grown accustomed to these turns in his temperament. They always preceded some bold maneuver, some risk that bordered on the theatrical. "Watson," he said abruptly, "do you recall the first thing Miss Elodie Rowland said?" She introduced herself as the executor of Howard Rowland's estate. "No, her first action. She did not stand when we entered. Politeness is not a virtue much practiced in legal affairs. True, but neither is unnecessary formality. Her stillness, her poise suggested something else." He spun on his heel and pointed to the mantel where the cracked mirror lay like a relic. She did not flinch at the sight of this. He continued, "Though by her own claim, she had reason to connect it to the death of a girl she claims to represent. No surprise, no revulsion, not even mild curiosity." "Why?" I shook my head. "Perhaps she was warned." "More likely," Holmes said, lowering his voice. "She had seen it before." That night, Holmes wrote a letter under the name of Professor Inigo Call, a fictitious scholar of mystical dramaturgy, with credentials so elaborate they could only have been false. In the letter, Call professed admiration for Jasper Hales and claimed to be preparing a monograph on the recent rights of return performances of which Miss Annalise Rowland's last appearance was the centerpiece. "I am arranging a public presentation," Holmes explained, sealing the letter with melted wax and the insignia of the fabricated Royal Metaphysical Society. "Something irresistible to anyone who still believes the myth has power. You think Hales will take the bait? I'm counting on it. But it's not Hales I truly want. It's the one behind him. A may be unconscious in hospital, but there's another player. Someone who picked up the script where he left off." Holmes sent Wiggins to deliver the letter to Hales's lodgings in Bow Lane. Then he paced the length of the flat 3 times, lit his pipe, and finally sat in silence. He stared not at the fire, nor the mirror, but into the dark air beyond. The lamplight where theories were born. By midday the next day, a response arrived. It was folded inside a flyer from Hales's old performances, though this one was stamped with a new seal, a hand-drawn eye, encircled by radiating lines, almost theatrical, almost mocking. The note inside read, "If the scholar wishes to see the rite of closing, he must first learn the steps. A new performance begins tonight, midnight, Bishopsgate Theatre. No stage, only roof." Holmes smiled at the phrasing, deliberately cryptic, but very specific. "Do you trust it?" I asked. "No," he said, "but that is precisely why I will go." We arrived at Bishopsgate an hour before midnight. The theatre had long been abandoned, its facade boarded, its windows darkened, but its rooftop accessible by a rusted iron stairwell that curved like a question mark into the fog above. Holmes wore his black overcoat and cap pulled low. I followed, revolver tucked beneath my coat. Though Holmes had told me perhaps to dryly, he anticipated more artifice than danger. The rooftop was silent when we arrived, except for the wind that tugged at the ragged canvas sheets tied between chimneys, but someone had been there. Lanterns, unlit, were positioned in a circle, and in the center lay a perfect triangle drawn in white paint, not chalk. Holmes bent to inspect it. "This paint is fresh, hours old at most." He motioned for me to step back, then reached into his coat and produced a small vial from his chemical kit. "Potassium ferrocyanide," he said. "Harmless, but reacts with iron salts." He sprinkled a few drops along the triangle's edge. At once, faint blue lines shimmered into visibility, revealing a larger symbol beneath the triangle, one I hadn't seen before. A web, almost like a mandala, radiating outward. "This," Holmes said, "is new, not Hales's work. Someone else is layering meaning atop his framework." We heard the first sound, then a soft shuffle. Holmes turned sharply. From behind one of the rooftop's brick stacks, a figure emerged, a girl. For a heartbeat, I thought it was Annalise herself. Same dark curls, same lithe frame. But as she stepped into the lantern's glow, I saw the differences. Younger, thinner, uncertain in her movements. "Miss I," began, but she raised her hand. "I was told to come, that you would be here." "By whom?" Holmes asked gently. She hesitated. "I don't know his name. He found me last week. Said I reminded him of someone. Gave me this." She pulled from her coat a small mirror. Holmes took it carefully. It was shaped like a tear. He held it up to the gaslight. Etched on the back were the same triangle and eye. "This is not theater," Holmes said softly. "It's recruitment." The girl looked down. He said if I stood in the triangle, I'd see what she saw, that I'd feel her step across. Holmes stepped forward, gently touching her shoulder. "Miss, do you know who Annalise Rowland was?" The girl's eyes filled. "I know she wasn't mad. I've read her words. She was free." Holmes sighed and turned to me. "It was never about disappearing," he said. "It was about being seen, repeated, rewritten." He gestured for the girl to step back, then turned and faced the rooftops, far edge where fog concealed the city below. She was trying to escape the frame they built for her, he said quietly, but she became part of the ritual instead. "And this?" I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "This is the first repetition." Then, without another word, he knelt in the triangle and pressed his palm to the rooftop floor. There was no magic, no flash of vision, just the sound of London in the wind and the beating heart of a mystery not yet closed. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. The fog lingered thick and immobile over London that morning, and Holmes, though physically, still seemed no less shrouded by it in thought. We had returned from Bishopsgate at the first whisper of dawn. The girl, whose name was Lila Bain, had been sent by Holmes to Miss Vale's boarding house on Tottenham Court Road, accompanied by Wiggins and strict instruction not to engage with anyone else. She had protested, calling the rooftop right her moment, but Holmes had spoken with such quiet certainty that she relented. Now, back at 221B, the gas was low, the mirror shards were spread across the carpet like blackened bones, and Holmes sat motionless in his chair, one long finger resting on his lower lip. "She was a lure," he murmured at last. "They chose her to mimic Annalise. Same stature, same eyes, same vulnerability. To what end?" I asked. "To reset the scene, to enact the right again." But something interrupted them. I stood, pouring coffee from the sideboard. "You think they intended to harm her?" "Not in the conventional sense. She was to be transformed, not murdered." Holmes leaned forward and picked up the mirror shard shaped like a tear, the one Leela had been given. "They gave her this, Watson, and what does a mirror do? Reflect. More than that, it duplicates, it copies the self, frames it, imposes boundaries upon it. These people are not mystics. They are dramatists playing with archetype. They don't kill, they rewrite." Before I could respond, a knock interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson appeared, breathless. "Inspector Lestrade is here, sir. Urgent business." Les burst in behind her, his usual stiffness undone by haste. "Holmes, there's been another disappearance. Near identical circumstances. Just off Ludgate Hill." Holmes stood at once. "Who?" Lestrade hesitated, lips pressed thin. "Miss Madeline Vale." I dropped my cup. It shattered on the rug. Holmes was already moving. The townhouse on Ludgate Hill belonged to a cousin of Miss Vale, who, according to Lestrade, had received a short handwritten note that morning in Vale's hand. "I need silence. I'm going back to her. She was last seen around 4 in the morning, leaving quietly, taking only a small bag and her cloak." The cousin had assumed it was a poetic flight of emotion, but when the back door was found ajar in her room, in perfect order save for one thing, he'd contacted the police. Holmes examined that one thing now, turning it slowly in his gloved hands. It was another mirror shard, etched. I asked. "Yes," he replied, voice clipped, "but not with symbols, with words." He angled it to the light. I read the words aloud. She stepped lightly, and the roof opened beneath her. Holmes's jaw tensed. This was not left for poetry. "This is proof. They took her." Lestrade crossed his arms. "Now listen, Holmes. There's no evidence of foul play. The woman left of her own accord, according to the note. Then she did not write it." Holmes snapped. "Miss Vale would not refer to Annalise's vanishing as stepping lightly. That phrase comes from the performance's promotional copy. It's theatre language." He paused. "More importantly, she would never leave the girl." "You mean Miss Bain?" "Yes. She regarded her as a responsibility, a second chance." Holmes turned sharply toward the door. "We must find Leela, now." But when we returned to Tottenham Court Road, the boarding house was already in disarray. Wiggins met us at the foot of the stairs, wide-eyed and pale. "She's gone, sir." "What?" Holmes's voice was low, sharp. "Gone. Packed her things, left a note, said she was ready now." Holmes snatched the note from Wiggins's hand. "Tell him thank you. I've remembered who I am. I won't be afraid to dance this time." I felt the blood drain from my face. "She's following the script," I said, word for word. Holmes exhaled through his nose. "No, Watson, she is the script now." He turned on Wiggins. "Did she speak to anyone before she left?" Wiggins nodded. A man, sir. Well-dressed, tall, clean shoes, smelled like turpentine. Holmes's eyes flashed. Paint. He's the new playwright. The one behind the second act, I muttered. Precisely. Holmes looked out the window, then back at me. We must intercept the final performance. But where? Holmes's gaze narrowed. Not the rooftop, that's too exposed. Too public. He stepped to his desk and pulled down the city map. They've drawn too much attention already. They need somewhere symbolic, sacred to the myth but concealed. He pointed. Here. I leaned over his shoulder. The Curtain Theatre, I said. But its ruins, nothing remains. Exactly the perfect place to bury a resurrection. He closed the map. Tonight, Watson. Midnight. As the fog thickened, once more over London's East End, we approached the fenced-off grounds where the old Curtain Theatre had once stood. The crumbling brick was half swallowed by new construction, but the heart of the space where once Shakespeare's lines had rung into dusk remained untouched. And there, flickering within the foundations, were lanterns. 3 of them. Holmes crouched low behind a stone wall and signaled for silence. I followed his gaze. 2 figures were already inside the space. One was unmistakably Lila Bain, her dark hair now braided in loops, her dress the same style Annalise Rowland had worn in the final performance. The other a man, tall and angular, dressed in black, moved with the grace of an actor and the precision of a conductor. He carried no script. He was the script. Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. Now, he whispered, we wait. Let them perform. Let them believe no one is watching. And then, I asked. Holmes's eyes glinted with something cold and terrible. Then we end the story before it consumes her too. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. We crouched in silence behind a tangle of crumbling brick, the fog curling over the Curtain Theatre ruins, like a curtain drawn between acts. The figure beside Lila Bain moved with unsettling elegancy, step precise, each gesture practiced. Though I had never seen him before, I felt a chill of recognition. This was not an improvisation. This was choreography, a scene playing out exactly as intended. Holmes remained utterly still beside me, every nerve taut. He had slipped into that uncanny stillness I knew too well, the trance of total observation. The man lit the 3 lanterns and arranged them in a triangle. Then he motioned for Lila to step into the center. I have stood here before, she said softly. The man replied, then you remember the shape of truth. Lila closed her eyes. The wind caught the hem of her skirt, lifting it gently like the edge of a veil. The entire world, it seemed, held its breath. Holmes moved. He slipped from cover with the smoothness of a predator, circling wide to flank the performance without drawing attention. I followed, hand on my revolver, though I sensed this confrontation would require reasoning, not bullets. Holmes emerged from the shadows with slow, deliberate steps. I wonder, he said aloud, if the girl truly understands what role you've cast her in. The man turned. He was younger than I expected, perhaps, in his early 30s, with dark hair slicked back and a mouth that never quite closed. His coat was ink-stained. His eyes were sunken, fever-bright. He didn't startle. He smiled. Ah, he said. The detective enters late in the second act. How? Predictable. Holmes ignored the barb. You've taken liberties with the original production. The symbols are yours. The phrasing altered. You're not just restaging the writer, reinterpreting it. The man dipped his head theatrically. Interpretation is the final form of authorship. Then you must be Alexander Dom. He blinked, just once. So my name finally appears in the script. Holmes continued, voice even. Dom studied under Elliot Rowland briefly before Elliot withdrew from public life. An unremarkable pupil, in the beginning, but obsessed not with the science, but with the mythology of time. Dom tilted his head. You flatter me. No, Holmes replied coldly. You've stolen a dead man's delusion and staged it like tragedy. You've built a theatre not of brick and curtain but of memory and madness. Leela turned. He told me the right could free me, that I could step beyond what this world expected. Holmes met her eyes. He told Annalise the same. She died. And now Miss Vale is missing. Dom chuckled. Miss Vale is transcending. You treat it like a crime when it is transformation. I stepped forward. Where is she? Dom raised a hand, slowly, not in defense, but in invitation. Why ask me? Perhaps she will arrive in the third act. Or perhaps she has already exited. Stage left. Holmes's gaze darkened. You sent her into the ruins alone. Dom shrugged. She chose to go. I merely wrote a path. Holmes stepped closer. "You believe yourself the playwright," he said softly. "But you are merely a critic obsessed with another man's vision, rearranging his fragments into your own reflection. You saw the mirror not as a caution, but a calling." Dom's smile faltered. "You never met Elliot Rowland," Holmes continued. "I did. He was a man undone by meaning. The mirror didn't show him time, it showed him regret." Dom stepped back. "You don't understand. She wants to become Annalise, to finish what was begun." Holmes looked at Lila, then back to Dom. "Annalise was never meant to end. That's what you never grasped. The right wasn't a gateway, it was a trap." At that moment, a sound echoed through the ruins, a single, deliberate footstep. We all turned. Out of the darkness walked Madeleine Vale, but something in her was altered. She wore a dark cloak, and beneath it, a replica of Annalise's stage costume, the same white-laced corset, the same black sash. Her expression was blank, her eyes fixed not on us, but on the triangle of light. Lila gasped. "You're her." Holmes raised a hand. "No, she is herself. Don't let the costume fool you." Madeleine stepped silently into the lantern triangle, and turned to face Dom. "I've walked the frame," she said. "I've followed every word, but it's not a gateway, is it?" Dom said nothing. "It's a mirror," she continued, "and you've been feeding it your reflection." Dom's mouth opened, closed. She turned to Lila. "He doesn't want to free you. He wants to repeat you, over and over, until the world believes it's real." Lila stepped backward, trembling. Holmes nodded, once almost imperceptibly. "Miss Vale," he said, "I trust you have the letter." She reached into her cloak, and withdrew a folded envelope, which she passed to Holmes. He opened it, holding it high so Dom could see. "Your own confession," Holmes said. "Stolen pages from Elliot's journals, annotated in your hand. Plans to recreate the right of return with willing participants. You thought no one would notice the phrasing, but your metaphors betrayed you." Dom took a step forward, but Watson raised his revolver. "Enough," I said. Holmes moved past him and extinguished one of the lanterns, then another. Only one remained, casting long shadows across the ruins. "Do you see now?" Dom Holmes said. "There is no magic, no stepping beyond. Only people hurting, grieving, believing lies because the truth is unbearable." He extinguished the last lantern. Darkness settled. Dom did not speak again. Later, under the flickering gaslights of the police wagon, Lestrade thanked Holmes grudgingly for once again solving a crime that didn't look like a crime at all. But as we walked back through the waking streets of East London, I looked at Holmes and saw no satisfaction on his face, only quiet resolve. Did he truly believe it? I asked that she could be brought back. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Then, "It doesn't matter." He believed something more dangerous, that he could be the one to do it. And that, as Holmes knew all too well, was always the greater illusion. Chapter 11. The Bait-Holmes Grand Strategy. The morning after Dom's arrest dawned damp and colourless. London had returned to its sullen routine, the fog less spectral than the night before, but still hanging low like a curtain, unwilling to rise. Holmes stood by the window of our Baker Street sitting room, pipe idle in one hand, eyes distant. He had not spoken a full sentence in over an hour. I closed the newspaper and set it beside my untouched breakfast. "You're unsettled," I said, breaking the silence. Holmes did not move. "He was not the author," he said at last. "He believed himself the playwright. Yes, but he was merely the understudy." The tone was not his. The tone. Holmes turned toward me. The cadence of the mirror text, the phrasing in the right, the inscriptions on the shards, all of it. Dom lacked the originality. "Watson, he was rehearsing someone else's part. But you said he studied under Elliot Rowland." Holmes waved that away, briefly and only academically. "No, the true author, if my suspicions hold, was closer to Annalise herself, possibly even ... before her." I set down my tea. "You think the right didn't originate with Rowland?" Holmes' eyes gleamed. "Rowland refined it, but I believe it was shown to him." "By whom?" Holmes smiled thinly. "That, Watson, is what we are going to discover." We began, as Holmes always did, with the periphery. Miss Madeleine Vale, now staying in the care of her cousin and in more stable spirits, had agreed to return one last time to the Vale House archives. There, in the uppermost rooms above the drawing parlour, lay her father's private journals, boxed, neglected, and mostly unread since his death. Holmes and I arrived at dusk. "Your father," Holmes said to her gently, "was meticulous. That alone makes him dangerous." She looked confused. "Dangerous. In memory," Holmes clarified. "A meticulous man leaves fewer gaps. And gaps are where lies hide." She led us up the narrow staircase, its steps soft with age. At the top was a small antechamber, and beyond it, an archive with sloped ceilings and several stacks of boxes, many labeled in her father's distinct hand. We set to work. Holmes passed over receipts, financial ledgers, and correspondence with publishers, discarding them with increasing impatience. I occupied myself with the older volumes, some dating to Mr. Vale's student years at Balliol. They were full of poetry, half-written plays, fragments of philosophical reflections, and curious references to the unrehearsed moment and assent through mimicry. But it was Madeline who found the key. "This," she said, holding up a folder with a broken wax seal. "I remember this from my childhood." He called it the Black Script. He kept it hidden. Holmes took it with reverence. Within was a handwritten manuscript, bound crudely with twine. There was no title, only a phrase on the first page: "The right of return, as observed by Lucien Vale, 1876. Watson exclaimed softly. "Lucien Vale, that's her grandfather." Holmes flipped through the brittle pages with great care. His face darkened. "It predates Roland by nearly 2 decades. Do you think he invented it?" "No," Holmes said quietly. "I think he witnessed it." He turned to a page midway through, pointing. There, beneath a sketch of a woman standing within 3 lanterns, were these words: "The dancer cannot remember who she was. That is why she ascends." "That's the same phrase etched on Annalise's dressing mirror," I whispered. Holmes nodded. "And Dom was never aware of it. He straightened it was never about Elliot Roland or his theories. This rite is older. A private drama passed through certain hands, each refining, repurposing. Dom merely gave it new stage directions." Holmes closed the book. "And now we must find the current bearer." Back on Baker Street, Holmes paced furiously as the night grew late. He had ordered Wiggins to tail a list of names, minor figures associated with the failed production, including a set designer named Clive Ames and a retired theatre critic, known for his obsession with the occult. But it was not these names that haunted Holmes. They were never performers, he muttered. Always the same structure: one who writes, one who dances, and one who remembers. Yes, Watson, one who knows the right's true origin, one who passes it forward, the memory keeper. I was about to ask more when a knock came at the door. It was Wiggins, winded, eyes wide. "She's gone, sir, Miss Bain." Holmes was on him in a second. "Gone? How?" "Left in the night. Slipped. The guards watching her door left this behind." He handed Holmes a folded paper. Holmes read it aloud. "The mirror calls. I see her now. She beckons me through." Watson cursed under his breath. "She's been contacted," Holmes said grimly. "Someone knew where she was and whispered the right words. Not Dom. Someone cleverer." "Who, then?" Holmes stared into the fireplace, the flames dancing against his cheekbones. "She is being drawn to the original stage," he murmured. "You mean the Curtain Theatre again?" Holmes shook his head. "No, Watson, something older still. The Black Script speaks of an unfinished house, a theatre never opened, whose foundation is still echoing with the promise of a debut." I blinked. "But that could be anywhere." Holmes turned. "Not anywhere," he said. "Bethnal Green. There's a ruin near Weaver's Lane. Lucien Vale mentions it twice in the margin. UH by the iron sycamore." I stood then. Weaker Holmes was already reaching for his coat. "No, Watson. We wait." I froze. "Wait." Holmes gave a thin, unreadable smile. "Because the play is not yet over, and the final act, as ever, requires an audience." Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. It was shortly after 2 in the morning when Holmes stirred from his chair and stood, his movements precise, deliberate, like a man responding to a silent signal only he could hear. The coals in the fireplace had dwindled to ash, the fog beyond the window thickening into a silver sheet, and London's slept-tour pretended to. Holmes turned to me. "She will step through before dawn, Watson. We must be there to witness it, and prevent what cannot be undone." I rose at once. The phrase "step through" unsettled me more than I dared confess, echoing the words on Madeline Vale's note and the manuscripts Holmes had scoured for days. I had come to fear this rite Holmes spoke of, not for its supposed power, but for what it asked of its believers. We left 2-1 B Baker Street in silence, the gas lamps flickering in the mist, At the corner of Portland Place, a hansom waited as Holmes had arranged. He gave a single direction to the driver: Bethnal Green, Weaver's Lane. The ride took us through streets wrapped in fog and shadow. Holmes remained quiet beside me, but I could sense his mind working furiously. I had seen this state before, at Baskerville Hall, at Reichenbach, and once during the strange affair of the Sussex vampire. This was the Holmes who peered not only into facts, but into myth. We arrived at Weaver's Lane at precisely 2:45. The district was asleep, save for the dull clatter of a milkman's cart in the far distance. At the end of the crooked road stood a blackened fence, half swallowed by ivy. Beyond it, barely visible in the fog, were the skeletal remains of a half-built structure, its iron beams twisted and skeletal, its foundations sunken and cracked. The unfinished house, Holmes murmured. Lucien Vale described it as a stage where time once paused. I shivered, not from the cold. We slipped through a gap in the fence. Holmes carried no lantern. He moved instead by memory, tracing the coordinates he had assembled from journal entries, architectural records, and a page torn from a forgotten theatre program. At the center of the ruin was a shallow depression, where the boards of a stage had once been intended but never laid. Surrounding it were fragments of curved masonry, remnants of a collapsed gallery. And in the center, beneath the broken girders and creeping vine, stood Lila Bain. She wore the gown from the Mirror Dancer, the original, not the reproduction. Its fabric shimmered faintly in the moonlight, as if reluctant to stay in one time. Her hair was pinned up like Annalise's had been, and her feet were bare. She did not look at us as we approached. "She's deep in the part," Holmes said, softly. Too deep. I opened my mouth to call her name, but Holmes held up a hand. "Not yet." A shape moved behind her. From the shadows emerged an elderly woman in a woolen cloak. Her face was sharp, with a hawk-like nose and silver hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes, however, held the true revelation, bright and calculating, like Holmes' own. He turned to her without surprise. "Mrs. Isadora Valley." She smiled faintly. "So you've done your reading, Mr. Holmes?" "She is your granddaughter," Holmes said. "But you are the memory keeper, the last bearer of the right. You passed it to your son, who passed it to Annalise, who passed it unwittingly to this girl." She stepped forward. "The right is older than you know, Mr. Holmes, older than me, even. I have only kept the mirror clean and killed those who failed the reflection." Her expression did not change. "Some fractures cannot be mended." Holmes moved closer. "You were the one who guided Dom." She nodded. "He had ambition, but not enough reverence. That is why he failed." Holmes turned to Lila. "What have you told her?" "Only what she wished to hear," Isadora said. "That she could be more than what the world demanded. That she could choose her own fate, even if it meant becoming someone else." Holmes' voice was firm. "She is not Annalise. She doesn't have to be," Isadora replied. "She need only believe. Long enough, the right does the rest." Lila stirred. Her voice was small. "I remember lines I've never read. I hear her, Holmes." Holmes knelt before her. "Memory is a trickster, Lila, especially when grief is involved. Annalise died, yes, but not through failure. She escaped. The right is not a doorway, it is a loop." She blinked. "A loop. You said you danced in your sleep," Holmes continued, "that your feet moved without thought, and Annalise said the same in her final journal. I wake dancing, and I do not know for whom. It's not transcendence, it's possession." Isadora Vale's face twitched. Holmes stood slowly, never taking his eyes off Lila. "She doesn't want freedom, Lila. She wants a vessel. The right isn't about rebirth, it's about repetition, a play that never ends." Lila turned sharply toward her grandmother. "You said I could become more." Isadora said nothing. "You meant I could become less," Lila whispered. An echo. Holmes moved between them. "Step away from the center, now." For a long moment, Lila did not move. Then, trembling, she stepped backward. Holmes offered his hand. "Come back to yourself." She took it. The moment she left the circle, the wind changed. The fog thickened, and Isadora Valley for the first time looked truly afraid. "You've interrupted the right," she hissed. "The loop is broken." Holmes nodded. "And in breaking it, we've finally reached the end." We did not wait to see what would become of the ruins, nor of Isadora Vale, who sat silently as the police came to take her away. She did not speak again, but as we left Weaver's Lane, I turned once to look back at the place where Lila had stood. The wind had stilled. The fog had lifted, and for the first time in decades, the mirror did not call. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. The morning after the confrontation at Weaver's Lane broke grey and thin, the fog retreating like a wounded thing. Holmes did not sleep, nor did he speak much as we returned to Baker Street, save for a single murmured phrase as we stepped through the door. "She'd try one more time, Watson." I asked who he meant, but he only gestured toward the fireless hearth and reached for his violin. For the next hour, he played cheerful, not mournful, but with an urgency I had seldom heard. The notes were spare, circling like something searching for a way out. We had scarcely finished breakfast when Inspector Lestrade arrived, stamping the cold off his boots and looking more ruffled than usual. "We've just had word," he said. Without preamble, the girl Leila Bainchi's gone. Disappeared from her aunt's house not 20 minutes ago. Left the back door ajar. Her slippers were found near the kitchen. Holmes set the violin down. "Did anyone see her leave?" I asked. "Only the neighbor's boy. Said he saw her walking barefoot toward Gresham Square. Said she looked like she was sleepwalking." Holmes nodded once, slowly. "She is, in a manner of speaking." Lestrade frowned. "Come again." "She's not trying to escape us, Lestrade. She's trying to escape herself. We found her, just as Holmes predicted, in Gresham Square, a garden enclosed by iron gates, its paths overgrown and benches slick with dew. The square had once been fashionable, but no longer. It was a place London had forgotten. And perhaps that was why Leila had come. She stood near the broken fountain at the center, her back to us, arms loosely outstretched, as though waiting for a curtain to rise. The gown she wore was the same as the night before, the fabric now muddied and torn at the hem. Her feet were bare again, bleeding slightly from the cobblestones. Holmes motioned for Lestrade to hold back. We approached quietly, stepping through the sleeping square like intruders. Leila did not turn, but she spoke. "You were wrong, Holmes." His voice was calm. Was I? "She doesn't want a vessel. She wants witnesses, all of us, to remember, to perform the thing she could never finish." Holmes circled until he stood in front of her. Annalise Vale died during the final dress rehearsal of The Mirror Dancer. A slip, a fall, a fractured skull. The audience was empty. No applause, no curtain call. "She died incomplete," Leila whispered. "She only ever wanted to finish the last step." I felt a chill settle on my spine. Holmes's voice dropped to a hush. "And you think you can give it to her? She shows me where to stand, what to say. I feel her correcting me. Like I'm a mistake she's almost erased. I could take no more." "Leila, listen to yourself. This is madness. You're not a canvas to be overwritten." Her eyes flicked to me, full of sorrow. "But don't you see, I was never finished either." Holmes reached into his coat and drew out a folded program, worn and yellowed. He handed it to her. "The final performance, Leila Annalise's understudy." Her name was struck from the record, but I found it. Leila opened it with trembling hands. "You," she whispered. "Your mother," Holmes corrected. "She never told you. She was meant to replace Annalise, but the production collapsed, and she fled the stage forever." Leila swayed slightly. She feared what the role did to her. The dreams, the mirroring. She burned the scripts, left the theater, and chose a quieter life. And she hid the past from you for good reason. Leila let the program fall. "I can't go back," she said. "You can," Holmes said gently. "But first you must leave her behind." The moment held like glass on the edge of a table. Then, without warning, Leila turned and bolted. Holmes was after her instantly, and I followed through the rusted gate and down the narrow alley that spilled onto Marcombe Street. She ran not with desperation, but with purpose, as if led by an invisible hand. "She's heading for the Garrick," Holmes called over his shoulder. I understood at once. The Garrick Theatre, now closed for years, was the site of the original performance of The Mirror Dancer. Its main hall stood sealed, but the side door had been left unsecured during recent renovations. Leila reached it moments ahead of us, disappearing inside like a phantom returning to her stage. We followed. The interior of the Garrick was cavernous and dark. Dust blanketed the seats and balconies, and a thin shaft of moonlight fell across the torn red curtain. The theatre smelled of damp velvet and old regrets. We found Leila standing at center stage, staring into the empty stalls as though expecting an ovation. Holmes approached slowly. "This is where it ends, Leila. Not with a performance, but with a choice." She turned to him. "But it's all I have. Without her, I'm just ... me." Holmes shook his head. You are not her echo. You are her epilogue. You carry her memory, but you are free to write your own ending. Tears streaked her cheeks. Her lips moved, rehearsing the final line of the lost play. But then, hesitating, she stepped back. No, she said. Let her rest. And with that, she walked off the stage. Holmes exhaled, long and low. Outside, dawn was breaking. We walked her home in silence. There was no applause, no curtain call. Only a quiet closing of doors behind her as she crossed her threshold. Do you think it's truly over? I asked. Holmes glanced at the rising sun. It is for her. Then he paused. But the mirror still waits, Watson. And somewhere, someone will find the script again. We said nothing more. Chapter 14. Holmes closes in. The final clue revealed it. Was a week after the events at the Garrick Theatre, when Holmes at last resumed his usual posture, slouched in his armchair, with fingers steepled and eyes half-lidded, though I had learned by then that such a pose signified nothing of rest. Since Lila Bain's quiet return to her aunt's house, the newspapers had taken up the story in their usual erratic fashion. The mirror dancer cult, some cried. Mass delusion in the theatre district, claimed others. One enterprising journal even ran with the ghost. That took a bow. Holmes ignored them all, but I noticed a curious thing. He had not placed the case among his archives, not quite ready for retirement. He said one evening, catching me glancing at the empty slot in his index. And why is that? He sat upright. Because there is one final thread that has yet to be drawn. And it is not Annalise Vale who holds it, but someone far more cunning. I frowned. You mean Isidora? Holmes shook his head. No, Isidora Vale was a guardian of the legend. Yes, but she was also, in the end, its most tragic believer. No, Watson. I speak of someone else entirely. He rose, moved to the mantel, and retrieved a folded envelope. It was heavy, unsealed, and marked with the embossed insignia of the Ministry of the Arts. Holmes handed it to me. Inside was a letter written in an elegant, slanting script. My dear Mr. Holmes, I must thank you. Without your interference, I might never have learned how powerfully myth resists erasure. A role unplayed is only dormant, not dead. You taught me that. The right will find another stage. Until then, curtain down. RDI looked up. RD. Holmes' expression darkened. Reginald Dom. He lives. I could scarcely believe it. But he was presumed dead after the incident. At the warehouse, a presumption I allowed. Holmes said grimly. It suited our needs at the time. But I've come to see that Dom's vanishing act was not a failure. It was a prelude. He walked to the cabinet and withdrew the Vale family manuscript once more. Turning to a page I had seen many times, a sketch of a circular stage with cryptic notations, scrawled along the margins. Holmes tapped a line near the bottom. This glyph appears throughout the right. Dorm called it the second mirror. I dismissed it before, thinking it symbolic, and now I believe it to be architectural. He drew out a second Shitten elevation map of the newly restored Marlowe Pavilion in South Kensington. This theatre was recently renovated using private funds. He continued, a patron requested that the central stage incorporate a circular revolving platform. That patron was R.D. Fincher's pseudonym, recently adopted by one Reginald Dom, under whose alias the funds were transferred. I felt a slow unease crawl up my spine. He's building a new rite, I said. Holmes nodded, but this time not in shadows. He intends a public spectacle, one dressed in modernism, but built upon ancient bones. A premiere has already been scheduled. Do we warn them? Cancel the performance? Holmes gave a slow, measured shake of his head. No, that would only delay him. He must be drawn into the light and shown for what he is, not a mystic, not a visionary, but a master of coercion and suggestion. Then what do we do? He smiled faintly. We attend the theatre. And so, on a rain-polished Thursday evening, Holmes and I dressed not for war but for music, and took our seats among the distinguished patrons of the Marlowe Pavilion. The house was full, socialites, critics, debutantes, and even a handful of politicians murmuring in anticipation of a new experimental ballet, Reflections of the Flame. Holmes had secured seats in the third row, close enough to observe without attracting attention. The curtains lifted, the music began, and what unfolded was, at first glance, a feat of modern choreography, bodies swaying in uncanny synchrony, patterns traced and repeated across the revolving stage. But I could see it now. The mirrored steps, the half-familiar gestures. The right was alive again, halfway through Through the performance, a figure stepped from the shadows at the rear of the stage, announced in the program. Clad in grey, his face obscured by a lacquered half-mask, he spoke no lines but directed the dancers with a series of measured gestures. Holmes leaned toward me. "That is Dom. What will he do? He believes the audience must bear witness. That belief is his weakness." And then Nat. The moment the central dancer collapsed, as if struck from within, Holmes stood. He walked down the aisle without hesitation, mounted the steps to the stage, and faced the masked figure. Gasps echoed through the house. Holmes reached out and tore the mask away. The man beneath did not resist. His face was pale, eyes rimmed with the burn of sleepless ambition. It was Dom, older, gaunter, but him. The orchestra faltered. The dancers froze. Holmes turned to the stunned crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "this is not a ballet. It is a ritual disguised in artifice. A reenactment of obsession, dressed in silk." Gasps turned to murmurs. Someone near the orchestra shouted for the police. Holmes looked at Dom. "The loop ends here." Dom smiled faintly, but he did not speak. He turned, walked to the wings, and vanished from sight. Lestrade, waiting at the exit, took him into custody minutes later. The performance never resumed. Back at Baker Street that night, Holmes poured us both a glass of brandy. "So," I said, "the final clue." Holmes tapped the manuscript again. "The right was never about the dead. It was about the living and the void they felt compelled to fill. Dom was not the first to believe in its promise, but he was the first to cast it with a full audience. And the girl, she has written a letter," Holmes said, "resigned from the theatre, taken a teaching post in Cornwall. She says she hears only her own footsteps now." He raised his glass. "Two endings." I raised mine. And for the first time in many weeks, Holmes smiled. Chapter 15. The final gathering 2 days after Reginald Dom's arrest. Holmes summoned a most unusual company, 2221B Baker Street. The parlor was cleared of papers and cigars. Chairs were drawn in a half-circle. Even Mrs. Hudson was warned that no interruptions would be tolerated under any circumstances. The mood was ceremonial, and Holmes, though not a man given to pomp, moved through the room with the quiet precision of one arranging an act's final tableau. Watson and I took our usual seats by the fire. Inspector Lestrade arrived first, looking grimmer than usual and still disquieted from the dramatic arrest at the Marlowe Pavilion. A moment later, Leela Bain entered, not with the haunted look she had worn for weeks, but with something of steadiness, returned to her carriage. Her aunt, Mrs. Edwina Charcombe, accompanied her and sat with gloved hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Then came Mr. Bledsoe, the former stagehand who had first alerted Scotland Yard to the revived rehearsals at the Garrick. Behind him, to our astonishment, walked Isadora Vale herself. She looked older than her years and diminished somewhat since our first meeting. The sharpness in her eyes had dulled, but only slightly. Still, she offered Holmes a polite nod, as if acknowledging a fellow craftsman in their shared theatre of masks and meaning. When all was seated, Holmes closed the door and took his place at the center, his hands behind his back and his gaze sweeping over the group like a lantern across hidden corners. "You are all here," he began, "because you stood at one point or another on the edge of the same stage, some by choice, some by accident, and some through no fault of their own. Tonight, I will explain how the illusion was designed and how we, the audience, were meant to play our parts unknowingly." There was silence. Holmes turned first to Lestrade. "Let us begin with motive. Reginald Dom, once a minor playwright, had no real fame, no following, and no fortune. What he did have, however, was access to archives, blueprints, and most dangerously, to the private correspondence of Annalise Vale. He discovered something her sister had tried for years to bury, that Annalise believed The Mirror Dancer was not a mere play, but a writer reenactment of psychic possession passed down from ancient ritual theatre. "Rubbish," muttered Mrs. Charcombe. "Quite so," Holmes replied evenly, "but potent rubbish, Mrs. Charcombe, especially in the mind of a man who craved control. Dom believed if he could reconstruct the performance precisely gesture for gesture, breath for breath, he could awaken something transcendent. Not a ghost, not a demon, but a force, a presence born not of the dead, but of the minds of those who believed in the story." He turned now to Lila. "Miss Bain, you were chosen not because you resembled Annalise, but because your lineage made you susceptible. Your mother was Annalise's understudy. She, too, vanished from the public eye after the accident. Dorm believed the line had memory, and he sought to activate that inheritance through suggestion, sleep deprivation, and repetition. Lila paled but did not look away. He used the unfinished notes, the surviving music, and even the layout of the original theater to stage a resurrection. But what he forgot, Holmes added with sharpness, is that minds are not mirrors. They crack, they resist, and in that resistance, the illusion fails. Watson leaned forward. But what of the candle? Holmes, the one found in the dressing room, burnt through the stage floor. Ah, Holmes said, his eyes gleaming. The candle, the illusion's centerpiece. Dorm used a wax blend mixed with ammonium nitrate, a slow burn, deliberately calculated to fail, just as the dancer completed her final arc. The goal was not destruction, but spectacle. The hole in the floor, the scorch marks. He wanted the audience to believe something had passed through, something not of this world. Lestrade exhaled. So the entire thing, the dreams, the trances, the voices, it was all suggestion. Largely, Holmes said. But let us not underestimate the mind's willingness to build its own theater when offered even the faintest script. Miss Bain, in her state of heightened stress and unprocessed inheritance, was particularly vulnerable. Dom knew this and fanned the flames. Lila lowered her eyes. Yet, Holmes continued, there remains one final deception to address. He turned to Isadora Vale. Madam, you claim to know nothing of your sister's writings. You feigned distance. And yet it was you who delivered the final page of the Mirror Dancer into Dom's possession. Gasps fluttered through the room. Isadora raised her chin. I did, and I do not regret it. Why? Holmes asked. Because, she said quietly, Annalise never got her ending. The world moved on. Critics mocked the play. The company dissolved, and her name became a whisper. I wanted it performed once, properly, with dignity. Holmes's voice was soft. And you did not realize Dom had other plans. I did, she said, with sorrow rather than shame. But I believed I could control him. Holmes nodded slowly. And that, Miss Vale, is the tragedy behind all this. Each of you believed you were writing the script. None realized Dom had already cast the parts long ago. A heavy silence settled in the room. Then Holmes stepped back. You now know all that I know. What remains is not mystery, but meaning. Lila stood. Then I choose no more roles, she said. I won't dance someone else's ending. Holmes bowed slightly. Mrs. Charkham murmured agreement and led her niece from the room. Lestrade followed, muttering about filing charges and final statements. Bledsoe left in silence, and Isadora, the last to go, paused at the door. Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You gave us all a final act, even if it wasn't the one we expected. When the room was empty, Holmes sat once more. Watson, he said. Yes. Tomorrow, remind me to cancel the theater subscription. I laughed, but Holmes did not. Chapter 16. The Reveal. Holmes breaks down the crimit was the following morning, and I found Holmes precisely where I had expected him, seated at our breakfast table, untouched toast before him, hands laced beneath his chin, eyes fixed upon the mantel as if reading an invisible script. The case, for all practical purposes, had been resolved. Reginald Dom was in custody, his performance exposed, his intentions laid bare before the law and the public alike. But something lingered in Holmes's demeanor, an unsettled current beneath the still surface. I knew better than to interrupt until he was ready. At length, he spoke. You recall the inkstain on Dom's left sleeve, Watson? Of course, from the dressing room at the Garrick. Holmes nodded. At the time, it seemed inconsequential, but it was the key that unlocked the entire performance. I raised a brow. The ink. I thought the candle and the choreography. Yes, yes, he waved impatiently. Those were the visible mechanisms, the theater of deception. But the true crime lay behind the script. The ink was from a pen, used not for writing, but for altering a legal document specifically, the will of Annalise Vale, which Dom forged months before Lila Bain ever set foot on stage. I was stunned. The will? But why? Holmes rose and walked to the desk, where he drew forth a folio and laid it before me. Because, my dear Watson, the original copyright of the Mirror Dancer in its complete form had never legally passed into public domain. Isadora Vale, as next of kin, held rights, but she had refused all requests to publish or perform the work. And so Dom forged her sister's will to what? Claim ownership. Precisely. He forged an addendum, dated a month before Annal's death, leaving all creative rights to her most devoted student and visionary collaborator, a name Dom adopted in his legal petition as R.D. Finch. I turned the folio over. A notarized document bore that very signature. But how did you obtain this? I asked. From the Ministry of the Arts. Once I suspected the nature of the fraud, I had to move carefully, lest Dom sense we were looking beyond the stage. This, he said, tapping the page, was his true aim. Not resurrection, but ownership. A deception so complete that even the law would bow to his authorship. I let out a slow breath. And the rite, the rituals, the hallucinations. Holmes gave a half smile. All necessary theatre. Dom believed the legal case would fail without proof that the work still had cultural and mystical force. He needed a dancer to break, an audience to gasp, a mystery to bloom, and most importantly, he needed the illusion that Annalis's spirit still hovered over the stage. So he found a bloodline link. Lila Bannand conditioned her mind to respond exactly as the legend dictated. He returned to the table, pouring himself a cup of now-cold tea. I confronted Dom with the forgery the night before the performance. He said, he denied it, of course, but his arrogance betrayed him. He said, and I quote, "History doesn't care for ink, only applause." I shook my head. And so he risked it all for a fraudulent legacy. For more than that, Holmes said, his tone suddenly grave. He wanted immortality, not as a criminal, but as a resurrector. He wanted to be remembered not for the lies he told, but for the myth he revived. A pause followed, thick and reverent. "Holmes," I said quietly, "would it have worked if you hadn't intervened?" He looked at me, long and steady. It nearly did. We sat in silence. Outside, the world was unchanged. The milkman's cart rumbled down Baker Street, and a paperboy's call rang faintly from the corner. But within these walls, something darker had passed and been understood. "You mentioned the candle," I said, steering us back to firmer ground. "There's still something that troubles me. The hole in the floor, it was perfectly aligned with the forgotten trapdoor from the original Garrick layout." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Ah, excellent. Yes, that trapdoor had been sealed for years, yet Dom reopened it, not as an escape route, but as a symbolic gesture. He wanted the final moment to appear as though something had descended, vanished into time itself. It was sleight of architecture. Then the burning candle was the cue. More than that, it was the pivot between act and aftershock, a slow fuse calculated to burn through wax and floorboards simultaneously. When Lila reached her final position, she was to stand directly over the weakened plank, though Dom never intended her to fall. The impression would suffice, and had she moved but slightly, she might have, Holmes said, voice clipped, which is why I sabotaged the final rehearsal, shifted the markers, reduced the risk. I regret not informing her, but there was no time, and too much at stake. I leaned back, folding my arms. "So that was your late-night excursion." Holmes permitted himself a rare smile. "You were snoring. I judged you beyond notice." We shared a laugh, though the weight of it soon returned. "There's one final matter," I said. "Isadora." Holmes's smile faded. "She will not be charged. The ministry, in its infinite bureaucracy, finds her testimony essential in confirming Dom's motive and the authenticity of the original manuscript. In exchange, she walks free, and Leela, she has severed all ties with the stage," Holmes said. "Returned to Cornwall, as we expected. I dare say she may recover, in time, but the dreams those may take longer." He rose and approached the window. "Some stories end, not with applause, Watson, but with silence." "And Dom?" I asked. Holmes turned from the window. "He'll be tried for fraud, attempted coercion, and several violations of performance safety law. But he will not be remembered as a playwright." No, Holmes said. "He will be remembered as the man who tried to choreograph belief and failed." And with that, he tapped his pipe on the ledge, exhaled, and said nothing more. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Trial of Reginald Dom commenced in late March at the Central Criminal Court. Holmes, who ordinarily had little patience for the theatricality of the courtroom, attended each day with silent vigilance. I accompanied him on most occasions, partly for the sake of company, but also because I sensed in Holmes a rare and somber investment, not merely in the outcome of justice, but in the fragile morality that had been strained during the case. Dom appeared in the dock each morning composed, if not confident. He wore a crisp grey coat and carried himself like a misunderstood genius, his gaze occasionally sweeping toward the press gallery as though expecting a future playwright to immortalize his words. His defense argued, with eloquence and flair, that the events at the Garrick Theatre were never intended to deceive, only to revive interest in an unfairly buried piece of dramatic history. They claimed the document Holmes uncovered had been misinterpreted, not forged. The prosecution, however, presented the forged signature, the altered rehearsal schedule, the chemical analysis of the candle, and the damning psychological manipulation of Lila Bain with such precision that even Dom's expressions began to fracture. The trapdoor's reconstruction and the misused legal filing under R.D. Finch left little room for interpretation. Lila Bain did not attend the proceedings. She had withdrawn entirely from the public eye, sending only a brief written statement, which was read aloud by her solicitor. Her words, though restrained, shook the chamber. "I was not merely an actress in Mr. Dom's production, I was an unwitting vessel in his desperate attempt to manipulate belief. I stood on that stage not as myself but as a reflection of someone else's delusion. I have left the theatre, and I do not wish to return, not because I am ashamed, but because I now understand that some performances are not meant for applause, but for silence." Holmes leaned toward me when the words were spoken. "She has grown stronger," he said quietly, "because she refused the part he cast for her." At the end of the 5th day, the jury required only 2 hours to return their verdict. Guilty, all counts, forgery, endangerment, fraud, and unlawful manipulation of performance safety codes. As the foreman spoke, Dom did not flinch. Instead, he gave the faintest nod, as if still believing the final curtain had not yet fallen. He was sentenced to 12 years imprisonment with no possibility of parole for the first 6. The courtroom murmured its approval. Afterward, on the steps outside, Inspector Lestrade found us. "There's something off about that man," he muttered, watching Dom being led into a black carriage. "You'd think he was going to a gala, not prison." "He believes in his myth," Holmes replied. "The audience has changed, but the performance, at least in his mind, continues." We walked together to the edge of the street, where fog was beginning to roll off the Thames in low, curling fingers. Holmes paused there. "There are moments," he said, "when our work feels no different from Dom's. We, too, stage reconstructions. We suggest motives, build tension, direct suspicion, and ultimately reveal the ending. But there is one crucial difference." I glanced at him. "And what's that?" "We do not lie to our audience," he said. "We demand they observe, that they think, that they earn the truth." I said nothing for a moment. Then, "Do you believe Dom will return to the theatre after prison?" "If he does," Holmes said dryly, "I doubt the candles will permit him." That night, we returned to Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson had left out a modest supper: cold beef, bread, and Stilton, which Holmes ignored entirely. He retired to his armchair and resumed his violin, drawing out slow, aching notes that spoke not of triumph, but of weariness. The final passage of the case had exacted something from him that no courtroom could restore. I leafed through the latest edition of the Strand, where a short column under the arts section offered a final coda to the story. The Mirror Dancer, long dismissed as an incomplete and occult curiosity, may never again be staged, and perhaps rightly so. Some performances, once attempted, reveal not their subjects, but their manipulators. Let this final act serve not as resurrection, but as reckoning. I folded the paper and watched Holmes in the firelight. "Do you regret taking the case?" I asked at last. He lowered his bow, but did not look at me. "No, Watson. I regret only that it had to be taken at all." The flames crackled. Beyond the windows, the mist of London thickened, curling against the panes like a memory seeking re-entry. Holmes raised his violin once more, and as the low notes trembled through the parlour, I could not help but imagine the stage once more, the faded boards, the final position of the dancer. The whole burned not just through the floor, but through time, and still Holmes played. Chapter 18. Holmes' final reflection. The case of the Mirror Dancer, as the newspapers soon dubbed it, faded from the public eye with a curious swiftness. After the initial fervour of Dom's conviction and the theatre's brief closure for spiritual cleansing, London's attention, as it often does, turned to fresher scandals. But within the walls of 2-1B Baker Street, the echoes lingered longer. Holmes had resumed his old habits with an air of fatigue that I, his oldest companion, had seldom seen in him. He was not melancholy, no. Holmes had always stood apart from such conventional moods. Rather, it was as though the entire affair had tapped some deeper well of energy, some reserve of moral intensity he preferred not to touch unless necessary. "I have been thinking," he said one afternoon as we sat by the fire, the sleet lashing the windows with dull insistence, "about mirrors." I looked up from my notes. Mirrors. Yes, fascinating devices. They offer a perfect likeness, yet are incapable of truth. In the theater, a mirror is illusion's closest ally. In the courtroom, it becomes metaphor. In Dorm's hands, it became a weapon. I nodded slowly. "You mean he used people as reflections?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his long fingers steepled. "He saw in Lila Bane not a person, but a shape to be bent toward his narrative. The same with Isadora Vale. Her grief, her guilt, her resemblance to her sister all became raw material. Even the audience was cast, unwittingly, into roles. Believers, skeptics, mourners, witnesses. You included," I added. Holmes gave a rare, mirthless smile. "Indeed, I was not immune. He invited me to believe in something impossible. And for a moment, Watson, I nearly accepted." I blinked. "You don't mean—" "I mean that when Lila stood above that candle, in her trance, lit by that ghastly pale, I wondered not rationally, of course, but fleetingly, if some fragment of Annalise had returned. Dom designed the scene too well. Even logic has shadows." The fire popped, releasing a little spurt of smoke. Outside, the lamplighter made his slow passage down the street. "But you didn't fall for it in the end?" I said. "No," he replied, softer now, "because the facts resisted. Ink dries differently. When exposed to air, witnesses remember things in conflict. Dust settles in corners it shouldn't. True reality is stubborn. It speaks in small, measurable objections. That is where I find my truth, Watson, not in candlelight or dreams, in the dust." There was a quiet between us, not uncomfortable. I had often wondered what toll these more esoteric cases exacted from Holmes, not just intellectually, but philosophically. He was a man grounded in method and deduction. But that did not mean the darker flights of human imagination left him untouched. "You haven't spoken of Isadora," I ventured. "She has taken her late sister's name," Holmes replied after a pause. "A legal change. I believe she intends to finish the full script of The Mirror Dancer on her own terms, quietly, no publishers, no stage." "That's admirable," I said. "It's dangerous," Holmes countered. "Some ghosts should not be fed, but perhaps she will give it peace. And Lila," he met my gaze then, eyes sharpened. "She has written me." I straightened. "Truly, a short letter, no address, no request, just a note. I have begun to dream of hills and gardens, not stages. Thank you for seeing the part of me that wasn't acting." I was silent. "She will be all right," Holmes added, "not unscarred, but whole. And that, I think, is the best we can offer anyone touched by such madness." We let the fire burn low. Holmes rose eventually and crossed to the windows, where he stood a long while gazing into the fog. "I often think," he said quietly, "that detection is not the pursuit of truth, but the removal of illusion. We peel back performance after performance until all that's left is the actor's breath, the real, trembling heartbeat beneath the role. And sometimes what we find is not evil, but yearning, not genius, but desperation." He turned to me. Reginald Dom was not a monster. He was a man who feared time, who feared being forgotten, and so he tried to script his memory into permanence. "But history," I said, "has a different editor." "Quite so," Holmes murmured, smiling faintly, "and unlike Dom, it does not take curtain calls." The wind moaned faintly down Baker Street. Holmes poured himself a small glass of brandy and offered me the same. "We toasted nothing in particular. Then, without warning," he said, "there's a theft at the British Museum that may interest you. Something about a vanished cartouche and a curator who speaks 7 dead languages." I grinned. "Another ghost?" Holmes shook his head. "No, just dust, Watson. Glorious, perplexing, honest dust." And just like that, the dancer's shadow faded behind us, left upon the stage-boards of memory, its final bow taken, its mystery dispelled. The candle had burned, the illusion had passed, and the great detective moved on.